Funny how some people can spend billions and still fail to recognize value when it is standing right in front of them. The laughter began almost instantly. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across the grand ballroom of the Whitmore Foundation Gala in downtown Chicago. Hundreds of guests filled the room, dressed in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, sipping sparkling water from crystal glasses while a jazz ensemble played softly near the stage. It was the kind of event where every smile seemed carefully practiced and every conversation carried the weight of money, influence, or opportunity. At the center of it all stood Graham Whitmore, the billionaire CEO of Whitmore Capital, a man whose name appeared regularly in financial magazines and business headlines across America. That evening was supposed to be a celebration. In less than 48 hours, Whitmore Capital was expected to finalize a historic $2 billion international partnership, a deal that financial analysts were already calling one of the most significant business agreements of the decade. Investors were excited. Reporters were waiting. Competitors were watching. Everything appeared perfect. Then Graham's daughter noticed an elderly black woman sitting alone near the back of the ballroom. She wore a simple navy dress that looked decades older than the clothing surrounding her. Her silver hair was neatly arranged. A small leather purse rested beside her chair. Unlike most guests, she carried no visible signs of wealth, no jewelry worth discussing, no entourage, no attempts to impress anyone. She simply sat quietly observing the room. "Who invited her?" the daughter asked with a laugh loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Several heads turned. The woman remained calm. Graham glanced toward the table and shrugged. Probably someone from the community outreach list. More laughter followed. Another family member smirked. "She looks completely lost." A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, but nobody spoke up. The elderly woman merely folded her hands and continued listening to the music. There was something unusual about her composure. Most people would have looked embarrassed. Most people would have left. She did neither. Instead, she sat quietly as if she had seen scenes like this before. As if the opinions floating around the room meant very little to her. Across the ballroom, conversations resumed. Waiters moved between tables carrying silver trays. Large digital screens displayed promotional videos celebrating Whitmore Capital's growth and future plans. The mood remained festive, yet something about the interaction lingered in the air. Several guests found themselves glancing back toward the elderly woman. Who was she? Why had she arrived alone? Why did she seem completely unaffected by the whispers surrounding her? Graham certainly did not care. His attention remained fixed on the upcoming deal. For months, his company had invested enormous resources into securing the partnership. Success would strengthen his position among the most powerful business leaders in the country. Failure was not something he even considered possible. Near the stage, investors congratulated him. Journalists requested interviews. Executives shook his hand. Everything was unfolding exactly according to plan. Yet while the room celebrated, the elderly woman continued watching quietly from her table. Her eyes occasionally drifted toward the presentation screens displaying financial projections and investment strategies. More than once, a faint expression crossed her face. Not anger. Not resentment. Something closer to concern. It lasted only seconds before disappearing. Nobody noticed. Nobody cared. To most people in the ballroom, she was simply an elderly guest who seemed out of place among the wealthy and influential. But appearances have a way of hiding extraordinary truths. And before the week was over, the same people who laughed at her would find themselves desperately wishing they had paid attention. The question was not whether the woman belonged in that ballroom. The question was whether anyone in the room truly unday. The gala ended shortly before 10 o'clock that night. Luxury cars disappeared into the Chicago traffic, while photographers packed away their equipment and hotel staff cleared the ballroom. Most guests left feeling impressed by the confidence of the Whitmore family and excited about the massive partnership that seemed only days away. Evelyn Brooks left without drawing attention to herself. No reporters stopped her. No executives introduced themselves. No one rushed to open a car door. She simply stepped onto the sidewalk beneath the cool night air and began walking toward a nearby train station. The city lights reflected against the glass towers surrounding downtown, creating rivers of gold and silver across the streets. To anyone watching, She looked like an ordinary retired woman returning home after a long evening. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains of a modest apartment on the south side of Chicago. The space was small but welcoming. Shelves filled with books lined one wall. Family photographs occupied carefully arranged frames. Several potted plants rested near the windows. Evelyn stood in her kitchen preparing coffee while a local news channel discussed business headlines from the previous evening. The Whitmore partnership was featured prominently. Analysts predicted enormous profits. Investors expressed optimism. Commentators described the deal as nearly unstoppable. Evelyn listened quietly before switching off the television. She carried her coffee onto a small balcony overlooking a community garden below. Volunteers were already gathering despite the early hour. Within minutes she was downstairs helping them prepare planting beds for the spring season. Children waved as she approached. Neighbors greeted her warmly. A young mother asked for advice about a scholarship application for her daughter. An elderly veteran thanked her for helping organize a local fundraising event the previous month. Everywhere she went, people seemed genuinely happy to see her. None of them cared about wealth. None of them cared about status. They knew her simply as Evelyn, the woman who always showed up when someone needed help. By late morning, she was seated beneath a shaded pavilion helping a group of teenagers review college essays. One student struggled with confidence and worried about being accepted into a competitive engineering program. Evelyn patiently reviewed every paragraph before offering suggestions. "Do not spend so much time trying to sound impressive," she told him gently. "Focus on being honest. Authenticity is more powerful than people realize." The student nodded and began making notes. Similar conversations followed throughout the day. Some people sought practical advice. Others simply enjoyed spending time with her. What nobody mentioned was the remarkable fact that decades earlier Evelyn had built a reputation that reached far beyond Chicago. Very few people knew that some of the investment models now taught in business schools had roots connected to her research. Even fewer knew she had once advised major institutions during periods of economic uncertainty. She never volunteered the information. She never felt the need. During lunch, one of the community volunteers asked whether she had enjoyed the gala. Evelyn smiled faintly. "It was interesting. Did you meet anyone important?" another volunteer asked. Evelyn looked across the garden where children were laughing while carrying watering cans between flower beds. "I met plenty of people," she replied. The answer drew smiles but revealed nothing. As the afternoon continued, her phone buzzed with an incoming email. She glanced at the sender and paused briefly. The message contained several pages of financial projections connected to the partnership currently dominating business headlines. Someone she respected had quietly requested her opinion. Evelyn opened the files. Her expression changed almost immediately. The numbers appeared impressive at first glance. Revenue forecasts looked strong. Market assumptions seemed reasonable. Yet buried deep within the structure was something troubling. She read the documents a second time, then a third. By the time she finished, concern had replaced curiosity. Slowly she closed the file and stared across the community garden. The laughter of children drifted through the warm afternoon air. Around her, life continued peacefully. But somewhere inside a boardroom filled with confident executives and ambitious investors, a serious mistake was moving rapidly toward becoming a very expensive reality. And for the first time since leaving the gala, Evelyn began to wonder whether anyone involved still had enough time to avoid it. Monday morning arrived with the kind of energy that only major business deals seemed to generate. Across financial news networks, analysts discussed market projections while investors monitored every update connected to the partnership Whitmore Capital was preparing to finalize. Inside the company's headquarters overlooking downtown Chicago, confidence filled every floor of the glass tower. Large digital displays highlighted projected growth figures. Assistants hurried between conference rooms carrying reports and presentation materials. Executives reviewed schedules packed with investor calls, media appearances, and final negotiations. Everywhere people looked, the message was the same. Success appeared inevitable. On the top floor, Graham Whitmore stood beside floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. The morning sunlight reflected across the water as he reviewed the latest briefing documents. Several members of his executive team sat around a polished conference table nearby. Their mood was optimistic. Some were already discussing expansion plans that would follow the completion of the partnership. Others spoke about future acquisitions and international opportunities. The atmosphere felt less like preparation and more like celebration. By this time next week, one executive said, we will be operating on an entirely different level. Several people nodded in agreement. Graham smiled. He believed it too. Months of negotiations were finally reaching the finish line. The partnership promised access to emerging international markets and billions in long-term opportunities. Financial media had already begun describing it as a transformative moment for the company. Yet while confidence filled the room, one detail remained largely ignored. The partnership structure depended heavily on a series of market assumptions, extending several years into the future. Most executives viewed those assumptions as reasonable. Few questioned them. Fewer still examined them closely. Later that morning, Graham attended a strategy session with representatives from the international firm involved in the agreement. Lawyers reviewed documents. Financial advisors discussed timelines. Consultants presented risk assessments. Everything appeared organized and professional. Yet beneath the polished presentations, subtle concerns occasionally surfaced. One analyst raised questions regarding volatility within a specific international sector. Another suggested additional review of several long-term projections. The comments were acknowledged politely before the conversation moved forward. Nobody wanted to slow momentum. Momentum had become its own form of confidence. By early afternoon, Graham's daughter joined him for lunch inside a private executive dining room. She laughed while scrolling through social media posts from the gala. Pictures from the event continued circulating online. Influential guests shared photographs. Business publications highlighted the family's role in the upcoming partnership. Everyone is talking about us, she said proudly. Graham glanced at the screen. That is what happens when you build something significant. She smiled. Still thinking about that woman from the gala? The question surprised him. Not really. Good, she replied. She looked completely out of place. Graham returned his attention to the financial reports on the table. The conversation ended there. Neither realized how close that seemingly unimportant encounter was to becoming relevant again. Across the city, Evelyn sat quietly inside her apartment reviewing the documents she had received. Several pages remained spread across her dining table. Yellow notes marked specific sections. Handwritten calculations filled the margins. The deeper she examined the numbers, the more concerned she became. The problem was not obvious. In fact, it was hidden so well that many professionals might overlook it entirely. But Evelyn had spent decades studying exactly this type of financial structure. Experience had taught her that the most dangerous risks were often the ones disguised as opportunities. As afternoon sunlight drifted across the room, she completed another series of calculations and leaned back in her chair. The conclusion remained unchanged. If the underlying assumptions failed, the entire partnership could unravel far faster than anyone expected. The realization troubled her. Not because of the money involved. Money came and went. What concerned her was the number of employees, investors, pension funds, and community programs that could eventually be affected. She glanced once more at the contact information attached to the documents. For several moments she considered simply remaining silent. After all, nobody had asked for her help directly. Nobody at Whitmore Capital seemed interested in hearing from her. Then she remembered the ballroom, the confidence, the laughter, the certainty. Slowly, Evelyn reached for her phone. Somewhere inside one of Chicago's tallest towers, powerful people believed they had already won. But before the week was over, a warning they never expected to receive was about to arrive from the last person they would ever think to trust. The email was sent just before sunset. Evelyn reviewed it twice before pressing send. The message was concise, professional, and respectful. She identified a specific vulnerability hidden within the partnership structure and explained why several assumptions supporting the agreement deserved immediate review. She included supporting calculations, references, and enough detail to encourage a serious examination without overwhelming the reader. Then she closed her laptop and returned to watering vegetables in the community garden. Whatever happened next was no longer within her control. Across the city, The message arrived in the inbox of a senior financial analyst at Whitmore Capital. Unfortunately, it landed at the worst possible time. The executive team was moving rapidly toward final approval. Meetings stretched from morning until evening. Consultants filled conference rooms. Lawyers reviewed final language. Every department focused on execution. Few people were interested in unexpected complications. The analyst briefly opened the email, skimmed the first paragraph and frowned. He recognized neither the sender nor the name. A quick glance at her listed address suggested she was retired. Without reading the full report, he forwarded the message to another department with a short note, asking whether anyone wanted to review it. The email bounced through several offices before eventually reaching a junior associate. Curious, the associate opened the attached calculations and spent several minutes studying them. The numbers looked surprisingly sophisticated. More sophisticated than he expected. He considered escalating the report but hesitated. The company culture rewarded confidence, speed, and certainty. Bringing concerns into a process already nearing completion often earned frustration rather than gratitude. By the following morning, the email remained buried beneath dozens of newer messages. Meanwhile, Evelyn received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end belonged to a former colleague she had not spoken with in years. They exchanged pleasantries before discussing the partnership dominating financial news. "Everyone on Wall Street is talking about it," he said. "You sound worried." Evelyn looked through her apartment window toward the community garden below. "I am concerned." "That's serious?" She paused. "The risk is manageable if someone pays attention now." Her former colleague remained silent for several seconds. "Have you contacted them?" "I sent an analysis." "And?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "I doubt anyone has read it." Later that afternoon, preparations continued inside Whitmore Capital headquarters. Graham reviewed schedules while journalists requested additional interviews ahead of the signing ceremony. Investors called seeking updates. Television networks discussed projected economic benefits. Everywhere he turned, optimism surrounded him. During a meeting with advisors, one executive briefly mentioned receiving an unsolicited report questioning part of the agreement structure. The comment lasted less than 30 seconds. "Who sent it?" Graham asked. The executive checked his notes. "An elderly woman named Evelyn Brooks." Several people around the table exchanged blank looks. Nobody recognized the name. "Independent consultant?" someone asked. "Retired, apparently." A few smiles appeared. Graham shrugged. "If there were a real problem, our team would have found it already." The room quickly moved on to other topics. Yet one person remained thoughtful. Sitting near the far end of the table, a younger risk analyst quietly wrote the name Evelyn Brooks in the margin of his notebook. Something about the report had bothered him. Not because it looked incorrect. Quite the opposite. The calculations had been unusually precise. Still, the momentum surrounding the deal was overwhelming. Questioning it felt almost impossible. That evening, a private reception brought together investors, advisors, and several members of the Whitmore family. The atmosphere felt celebratory. Champagne glasses reflected the city lights visible through the tower's massive windows. Conversations centered on future success. Graham's daughter laughed while discussing luxury vacation plans she hoped to take after the signing ceremony. "Everything is finally coming together," she said confidently. Across the room, applause broke out as another guest praised the partnership's potential. Yet while confidence echoed through the reception hall, a single unanswered email sat quietly inside the company's servers. The warning had arrived. The opportunity to prevent a disaster still existed. But with every passing hour, certainty continued drowning out caution. And somewhere in her modest apartment, Evelyn looked over the skyline as evening settled across Chicago, unaware that the people she was trying to help were about to make ignoring her the most expensive mistake of their careers. The invitation arrived the following afternoon. Whitmore Capital was hosting a private networking reception at a luxury hotel overlooking the Chicago River. The event would bring together investors, advisors, consultants, and business leaders one final time before the signing ceremony. Most guests viewed it as a celebration. For Evelyn, it represented something else entirely. Earlier that morning, the young risk analyst who had noticed her report finally found the courage to respond. His message was polite and cautious. He thanked her for the analysis and asked whether she would be willing to briefly explain her concerns if an opportunity arose. Evelyn agreed immediately. She had no interest in recognition. She simply wanted someone to examine the numbers before it was too late. By early evening, she entered the hotel ballroom carrying the same modest leather purse she had brought to the gala. Crystal lighting reflected off marble floors. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the glowing Chicago skyline. Conversations filled the room. Laughter echoed between groups of executives discussing future profits. The atmosphere felt almost identical to the previous event, except now confidence had grown even stronger. The partnership appeared only hours away from becoming reality. Evelyn spotted the young analyst near one of the presentation displays. He greeted her warmly and introduced her to two colleagues who had reviewed portions of her report. Unlike others, they listened carefully. Questions were asked. Calculations were discussed. For nearly 20 minutes, the conversation remained professional and productive. Then everything changed. Graham Whitmore entered the ballroom surrounded by investors and members of his family. Cameras flashed. Conversations paused. Attention shifted instantly toward the billionaire executive. As he moved through the crowd greeting guests, his daughter suddenly noticed Evelyn standing near the presentation screens. Recognition appeared immediately. "You have got to be kidding me," she said loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear. The young analyst's expression tightened. Evelyn remained calm. Graham followed his daughter's gaze. "Mrs. Brooks," he said with visible surprise, "I did not expect to see you here." Several guests looked between them curiously. "I was invited," Evelyn replied politely. The answer seemed to amuse his daughter. "Invited to what exactly?" More people began listening. The analyst attempted to redirect the conversation, but the moment was already slipping away. "Actually," he said, "Mrs. Brooks submitted an analysis regarding—" "An analysis?" The daughter interrupted with a laugh. "The community outreach guest from the gala is reviewing a $2 billion partnership now?" A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the room. Graham did not laugh, but neither did he stop the exchange. Evelyn noticed that immediately. "I simply wanted to share some concerns," she said. "Concerns?" Another family member repeated. "Our advisors include some of the most respected financial experts in the country." "I am aware," Evelyn answered. "Then perhaps we should trust them." The comment drew scattered laughter. The analyst looked increasingly uncomfortable. One of his colleagues glanced down at the floor. Several guests exchanged awkward looks but remained silent. Once again, nobody wanted to challenge the room's most powerful family. Evelyn could have responded differently. She could have listed her accomplishments. She could have revealed her experience. She could have explained exactly why her calculations deserved attention. Instead, she simply folded her hands and remained composed. "I hope the partnership succeeds," she said quietly. "Then I hope you are wrong." The daughter smiled as though she had delivered a clever final line. Nearby guests chuckled politely. The conversation ended. Graham moved on to greet other investors. Music resumed. Waiters continued circulating through the ballroom. Within minutes, most people returned to discussing profits, expansion plans, and future opportunities. Yet not everyone forgot the exchange. The young analyst watched Evelyn leave the conversation with growing concern. Her confidence had not looked like guesswork. Her calmness had not looked like uncertainty. Most importantly, she had shown no desire to impress anyone. People seeking attention usually demanded recognition. Evelyn had done the opposite. Later that evening, she quietly exited the hotel and stepped into the cool night air. Traffic moved along the river below. Reflections shimmered across the water. Behind her, the celebration continued. Ahead of her, uncertainty waited. She had delivered the warning. Twice. The choice no longer belonged to her. But as the lights of downtown Chicago stretched across the horizon, a growing number of people inside Whitmore Capital were beginning to wonder whether the elderly woman everyone dismissed might understand something they did not. And by the time that question received its answer, the cost of ignoring her would already be impossible to undo. Rain arrived shortly after midnight. Thin streams of water traced their way down apartment windows across Chicago, while traffic lights reflected softly on rain-slick streets below. Inside her modest apartment, Evelyn sat alone near the window with a cup of tea resting between her hands. The city skyline stretched across the darkness beyond the glass, its towers glowing beneath low clouds. The events of the evening replayed quietly in her mind. The laughter, the dismissive comments, the certainty displayed by people who had never taken the time to understand what she was trying to say. Yet despite everything that had happened, she felt remarkably calm. At 72 years old, Evelyn had learned something many people never discovered. Pride often made more noise than wisdom. She had seen it throughout her life. She had watched talented people destroy opportunities because they refused to listen. She had watched powerful organizations ignore warnings because success convinced them they were invincible. Most of all, she had learned that arguing with arrogance rarely changed anything. Time usually handled that better than words ever could. Across the room sat a wooden bookshelf filled with photographs and mementos collected over decades. As the rain continued tapping gently against the windows, Evelyn stood and walked toward one of the shelves. Her fingers brushed across a framed photograph showing a much younger version of herself standing beside a group of financial researchers. Another photograph captured her receiving an award during the early years of her career. A third showed community leaders gathered around a neighborhood investment project she had helped create years earlier. None of the pictures appeared in magazines anymore. Most people who attended the gala had no idea those chapters of her life existed. She preferred it that way. Recognition faded. Character remained. Meanwhile, several miles away inside Whitmore Capital headquarters, the building remained illuminated despite the late hour. The signing ceremony was now less than 2 days away. Teams continued reviewing contracts and preparing presentations. Yet beneath the surface, small signs of unease were beginning to emerge. The young analyst who had spoken with Evelyn could not stop thinking about her calculations. Long after most employees left for the evening, he remained seated at his desk reviewing spreadsheets. The more he examined the assumptions supporting the partnership, the more questions appeared. Nothing looked catastrophic on its own, but taken together, several variables seemed far more fragile than company leadership believed. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, he sent a confidential message to another analyst requesting an independent review. Then he leaned back in his chair and stared out at the city lights. Something felt wrong. He could not prove it yet. But instinct refused to let him ignore the possibility. Back in her apartment, Evelyn eventually returned to the window. Rain blurred the city beyond the glass. She thought about the thousands of employees connected to the partnership, the retirement funds invested in its success, the families whose futures depended on decisions being made inside boardrooms they would never enter. Contrary to what the Whitmore family believed, her concern had never been personal. She did not want anyone to fail. She did not want anyone embarrassed. She simply wanted the truth examined before consequences arrived. A soft sigh escaped her lips. Then she switched off the lamp beside her chair and prepared for bed. The room grew darker. Only the city lights remained. Somewhere beyond the rain-covered skyline, executives slept comfortably believing The next morning began with uncertainty. Not panic. Not chaos. Just a quiet shift in the atmosphere inside Whitmore Capital. The kind of shift that experienced professionals immediately recognize but cannot yet explain. Employees moved through the headquarters as usual. Elevators carried executives between floors. Conference rooms remained occupied. The signing ceremony was still scheduled. Public statements were already prepared. Yet beneath the polished surface, questions had started spreading. The young analyst who had reviewed Evelyn's calculations arrived before sunrise and continued examining the partnership model. This time he was not alone. 2 additional analysts had joined him overnight. Together they rebuilt portions of the financial projections from the ground up, testing assumptions that previously went unchallenged. What they discovered made the room grow quiet. One market variable influenced another. One assumption supported several others. Individually, the risks appeared manageable. Combined, they created a vulnerability far larger than anyone had realized. Shortly after 8 o'clock, the findings reached a senior risk officer. Within an hour, the report landed on the desk of Whitmore Capital's chief financial officer. By mid-morning, emergency meetings replaced routine appointments. Graham Whitmore entered a conference room expecting a brief update. Instead, he found several members of his leadership team studying spreadsheets with expressions he had not seen in years. "What is happening?" he asked. Nobody answered immediately. Finally, the chief financial officer slid a report across the table. "We have identified a scenario that was not fully accounted for." Graham frowned as he reviewed the numbers. The implications became clear quickly. If specific international market conditions shifted even slightly, projected returns would collapse. Worse, several contractual obligations would remain active regardless of performance. The downside exposure was enormous. How was this missed? Graham asked. The room remained silent. Then the young analyst spoke carefully. "The concern was raised earlier this week." Graham looked up. "By whom?" Another uncomfortable silence followed. The analyst opened his notebook. On one page, a single name remained written in blue ink. Evelyn Brooks. For a moment nobody moved. Graham stared at the name. A memory surfaced immediately. The gala. The hotel reception. The elderly woman speaking calmly while everyone around her dismissed what she had to say. His stomach tightened. "You are telling me she identified this?" The analyst nodded. "Several days ago." The room grew even quieter. One executive quickly opened a laptop and began searching historical financial databases. Another contacted industry archives. What happened next stunned everyone present. Within 30 minutes, document after document began appearing on conference room screens. Research papers, industry presentations, historical investment models, advisory board records. The deeper they searched, the more astonishing the picture became. Evelyn Brooks was not simply a retired community volunteer. Decades earlier, she had been one of the most respected financial strategists in the country. Several risk assessment models still used by major institutions traced their origins back to research she had helped develop. Her work had influenced investment frameworks taught in graduate business programs across America. Multiple economic recovery initiatives had benefited from her guidance. Some of the executives staring at the screens had unknowingly spent their entire careers using systems influenced by her ideas. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, one board member leaned back in disbelief. "How did we not know this?" Nobody had an answer. Because nobody had bothered to ask. They had seen an elderly woman in a simple dress and assumed they already knew everything worth knowing. Across the table, Graham stared at the photographs now appearing on the screen. Younger images of Evelyn standing beside respected economists, industry leaders, and policy advisors filled the room. The realization settled heavily over everyone present. The woman they had laughed at possessed more experience than many of the people who mocked her combined. The woman they dismissed had tried to help them. Twice. Graham slowly closed the report and looked out toward the Chicago skyline beyond the conference room windows. For the first time since the partnership negotiations began, confidence disappeared from his face. The issue was no longer whether Evelyn had been right. The evidence made that painfully clear. The real question was whether they had discovered the truth soon enough. And as calls began arriving from concerned partners requesting immediate clarification, the answer was starting to look far more frightening than anyone in the room wanted to admit. The collapse began at 11:17 that morning. Not with a dramatic announcement or a crowded press conference, but with a single message arriving from the international partners' legal team. The email requested an immediate suspension of final signing procedures pending additional risk verification. Within minutes, executives throughout Whitmore Capital received copies. Conference rooms that had been preparing for celebration suddenly shifted into crisis management. Advisors who spent weeks discussing future growth were now focused entirely on understanding present danger. The atmosphere inside headquarters changed almost instantly. Phones rang continuously. Emergency meetings filled every available room. Investors demanded answers. Financial journalists began hearing rumors that something was wrong. By noon, the partner organization requested access to every supporting projection connected to the agreement. Independent auditors were brought into the review process. The findings only reinforced the concerns already identified. The vulnerability Evelyn had warned about was real. Worse, it was significant enough to affect the long-term viability of the entire structure. At 1:43 in the afternoon, the call everyone feared finally arrived. The international partner officially withdrew from the agreement. Years of negotiations ended in less than 10 minutes. The signing ceremony was canceled. Planned announcements were suspended. Future discussions were frozen indefinitely. Silence settled across the executive floor. Graham sat alone in the conference room after the call ended. The Chicago skyline remained visible beyond the glass walls, but he barely noticed it. Documents covered the table in front of him. Reports, risk assessments, market analyses. All of them pointed toward the same conclusion. The warning had been accurate. The opportunity to prevent the disaster had existed. They simply ignored it. For the first time in years, Graham felt something unfamiliar. Not frustration. Not disappointment. Regret. Deep, unmistakable regret. Across the city, financial news outlets quickly changed their headlines. Analysts who had predicted historic success now discussed the unexpected collapse. Industry commentators questioned how such an experienced organization could overlook a risk of that magnitude. Investors expressed concern. Competitors watched carefully. Yet the most painful conversations were happening inside Whitmore Capital itself. During an emergency board meeting, one director asked a simple question. If Mrs. Brooks had been taken seriously on the first day, would this have been avoided? Nobody answered immediately. Eventually, the chief financial officer spoke. Most likely, yes. The room fell silent. Several executives looked away. Some stared at the table. Others reviewed documents they had already read multiple times. The truth had become impossible to escape. This was not merely a financial failure. It was a failure of judgment, a failure of humility, a failure to listen. Later that afternoon, Graham's daughter sat quietly in her office. For the first time since the gala, she searched Evelyn Brooks online. Article after article appeared on her screen. Academic publications, industry awards, archived interviews, historical photographs. The deeper she looked, the worse she felt. There was Evelyn standing beside respected economists. There was Evelyn advising major institutions during periods of economic uncertainty. There was Evelyn receiving recognition for contributions that had influenced generations of financial professionals. The woman she had laughed at possessed a legacy that many executives spent entire careers trying to build. Slowly she closed the laptop. The memory of her own words at the hotel reception returned with painful clarity. Across headquarters, similar discoveries continued. Employees shared articles. Executives exchanged information. Piece by piece, a fuller picture emerged. Yet no revelation was more powerful than one simple fact. Evelyn had never used her reputation to demand respect. She had never introduced herself by listing accomplishments. She had never tried to embarrass anyone. She simply offered help. Twice. As evening approached, the celebration banners prepared for the signing ceremony were quietly removed. Catering orders were canceled. Guest lists became irrelevant. Empty conference rooms reflected the fading sunlight. The deal was gone. $2 billion in opportunity had disappeared. But for Graham, the financial loss was no longer the part he thought about most. As he stood beside the window watching the sun descend behind the Chicago skyline, one realization repeated itself again and again. The most valuable person in the entire story had walked directly into their lives, offered them a chance to avoid disaster, and left with dignity after being treated as though her voice did not matter. And now that they finally understood who she truly was, there was only one thing left to do. Find her, apologize, and hope that somehow, despite everything, she would be willing to hear what they should have said from the very beginning. The following morning arrived bright and clear. The storm clouds that had covered Chicago only days earlier were gone, replaced by soft sunlight spreading across neighborhoods, office towers, and quiet streets. In a community garden on the south side of the city, volunteers were already planting flowers and tending vegetables beneath a calm blue sky. Children laughed as they carried watering cans between rows of green plants. Elderly neighbors sat beneath shaded benches sharing stories. Life moved forward with its usual rhythm. At the center of it all stood Evelyn Brooks, wearing gardening gloves and speaking with a group of local students about a scholarship program. Her voice remained warm. Her smile remained genuine. Nothing about her suggested someone who had recently witnessed the collapse of a multi-billion-dollar business deal. Shortly after 10 o'clock, a black sedan pulled up beside the garden entrance. Several volunteers looked up curiously. Moments later, Graham Whitmore stepped out of the vehicle accompanied by his daughter. Neither carried the confidence that had surrounded them at the gala or the hotel reception. There were no reporters, no assistants, no photographers, just two people walking slowly toward the woman they had underestimated. Evelyn noticed them immediately. She removed her gardening gloves and greeted them politely. "Good morning." For a moment nobody spoke. The city seemed strangely quiet. Even the children nearby lowered their voices as if sensing the importance of the moment. Finally, Graham took a deep breath. "Mrs. Brooks, I owe you an apology." The words came without excuses, without explanations, without attempts to shift responsibility. "You tried to help us," he continued. "More than once. We ignored you. Worse than that, we treated you with disrespect." His daughter lowered her eyes. "I treated you with disrespect," she said softly. "I am ashamed of it." Evelyn listened quietly. The morning sunlight illuminated the garden around them. A gentle breeze moved through the flowers. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she smiled. Not because the situation was amusing, because she understood something they were only beginning to learn. "People make mistakes," she said. "What matters is what they learn from them." Graham nodded slowly. "The deal is gone." "I know. And you were right." Evelyn looked toward the children working nearby. Being right was never the goal. The answer seemed to surprise them. She could see it in their expressions. They expected anger, perhaps bitterness, maybe even satisfaction. Instead they found peace. "I never wanted anyone to fail," she continued. "I wanted people to listen before failure became necessary." The three stood quietly for a moment. The garden around them felt far removed from boardrooms, negotiations, and financial headlines. Yet somehow it felt more important than all of those places combined. Graham eventually asked the question that had been weighing on him since the collapse. "Would you help us rebuild?" Evelyn considered the request carefully before shaking her head. "No." The answer was gentle but firm. "There are people inside your company capable of doing that. What they need now is not another expert. They need a different way of listening." Graham absorbed the words in silence. Deep down he knew she was right. Some lessons could not be delegated. Some had to be lived. Before leaving, he thanked her again. This time the gratitude felt sincere. His daughter offered one final apology, which Evelyn accepted with kindness. Then the two returned to their vehicle and quietly drove away. Evelyn watched them disappear beyond the corner before turning back toward the garden. A group of children immediately approached with questions about a school project. She laughed and joined them beneath the morning sun. Across the city, newspapers continued discussing financial losses, failed negotiations, and missed opportunities. But none of those stories captured the most important truth. The real lesson had never been about money. It had never been about billion-dollar agreements or corporate influence. It was about dignity, about character, about the danger of judging human worth through appearances. As the sunlight settled across the garden and children continued planting flowers beside neighbors who cared for one another, Evelyn returned to the simple work she loved. No cameras recorded the moment. No headlines celebrated it. Yet in that quiet place filled with life, kindness, and second chances, justice felt complete. And for the first time in a very long time, the city seemed a little wiser than it had been the week before.